Join me for a conversation with podcaster Glenn McDorman.
Welcome to DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. Level up your RPG campaigns by filling yourself with stories and knowledge. Explore topics from archaeology to film history to writing to literature and much, much more. This is DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show.
Welcome to the show. My name is Matt and I am your host. This is the podcast where we learn how to become better game masters and role players by filling ourselves with stories and knowledge. And my mission continues today with an amazing interview about a podcaster who delves into science fiction and fantasy literature. It is a great conversation. Just quickly before we jump in, if you are running games and you need some help, I create tabletop RPG resource books that can help you cut down your prep time and help you have more fun at the table. You can find those at Amazon.com, on DriveThruRPG.com, and my own website, DiceGeeks.com. Just search for the word dice and the word geeks put together on Google or any of those sites that I mentioned, and you will find my books. Now, let's jump into the episode. My guest today is writer and podcast host Glenn McDorman. Glenn, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Matt. I'm really happy to be here.
Oh, no problem. It's my pleasure. Now, I said you were a podcast host. You have, I believe, 5 podcasts that you are hosting right now. And they all have kind of a literary or science fiction kind of bent to them. When did you kind of fall in love with speculative fiction?
Wow. I mean, really, I would say almost from as long as I can remember. Childhood books were really crucial to this, but maybe this is things like reading John Bellairs, like the House with the Clock in Its Walls, and Roald Dahl at a young age. But I would say really middle school is when this solidified for me. I discovered Edgar Allan Poe. My grandfather had this amazing leather-bound, gold-leafed collection of everything Edgar Allan Poe ever wrote, and H.P. Lovecraft was coming in at the same time. I'd already read The Lord of the Rings and fallen in love with that, but was now also discovering Dragonlance, and then, as a consequence of that, Dungeons and Dragons as well. Star Trek: The Next Generation was on the air, so yeah, 7th grade was just this lightning rod for me.
Oh, that's fantastic. And some similar things there in my background as well. I think I was in 7th or 8th grade when Star Trek: The Next Generation came on the air as well, and kind of revolutionized my TV watching, I think, at that time, because I could not miss an episode. So every Saturday night I was watching Star Trek: The Next Generation. Yeah,
same here. And we got them in where I grew up in the Chicago suburbs. We got them back to back. The new one, but then was preceded by something that was already in syndication, and so it was a perfect 2 hours every Saturday.
Oh, wow. Yeah. I grew up in St. Louis, outside in the St. Louis area in Missouri, and we got them at 10:30 on Saturday night. But we had to wait a while for syndication. But when that came on, I was watching Star Trek 7 days a week.
Yeah, it was a good life, right? I know most of us are supposed to, remember our middle school years without any fondness and remember all the trauma of going through puberty. But I don't know. I miss just being able to live only in science fiction and fantasy and supernatural horror literature and TV shows without any worries about anything in the real world.
Yeah. I kind of mentally suppressed all of that other stuff that happened, and all I remember is Star Trek.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, I did say, you were the host of, podcast, but, you are the host of like 5 podcasts, and one of them, you already kind of mentioned Lovecraft. One of your podcasts is called Elder Sign, and I assume that Lovecraft is kind of a staple on that podcast.
He sure is. Yeah. Elder Sign is our weird fiction podcast. This I do with my co-host, Brandon Buddha. And what we do, 2 episodes a month. It's a bi-weekly show. We read short weird fiction by H.P. Lovecraft, Edgar Allan Poe, Jeff Vandermeer, China Miéville, Stephen King, in fact, really the whole gamut, 19th century, 20th century. And we read a bit of short fiction, a short story or a novella, and we talk about it. And our our real angle is two things. One, Brandon and I are both writers with fewer publications to our names than we would like, but with some, and are hoping to do more. And so we're looking at writing craft as a big part of what we do, but then intellectually we take a really sort of attempted scholarly look at what these stories can tell us about the society that they emerge from, right? What are the concerns of that are embedded in this story, or the assumptions about the world that are embedded in this story? And especially when we're looking at older works from the 19th century, whether that's Edgar Allan Poe or Charles Dickens maybe, or the interwar period where we've got H.P. Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard and Clark Ashton Smith. What are their worlds like? What are their worldviews like? What can we tell by seeing what they're afraid of?
What was Poe trying to tell us?
Wow, yeah, Edgar Allan Poe is really one of my favorite writers. In fact, we're getting ready to do his one of his very early stories, a Gothic story called Metzengerstein soon. But something that we resisted the temptation to do the Mask of the Red Death when we went on lockdown, I guess, in the spring of 2020 with COVID-19. But it turns out that Mask of the Red Death was not the only disease story that Poe wrote. That really a huge number of his stories are about being afraid of cholera, which is not something that I ever really thought that much about. Cholera was something that seemed historical, and in fact, I'm sure that I was deep into high school and before I really understood what cholera was, which then only learned about really because of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, right? Love in the Time of Cholera. But he was quite concerned about that because he was writing during the third cholera pandemic, and that was really quite interesting. But also, Poe is writing at the cusp of the between early modernity and high modernity, really meaning the cusp between the modern world before the Industrial Revolution and the modern world after. Of course, we're living in the industrialized world, or really maybe the post-industrialized world now. So Poe is living at a time when things that we take for granted were being invented and were often uncomfortable for him. And so the very first story that we did on Elder Sign was the Murders in the Rue Morgue, which is one of these very first C. Auguste Dupin mystery stories that go on to inspire Sherlock Holmes and basically the entire genre of detective fiction, which is the famous one in which it turns out that the criminal was an orangutan and not a person after all, right? Which is just a totally crazy twist ending. But this story that's we all remember as being about this crazy twist ending is really Poe grappling with the advent of industrialized modernity. Things like policing, police forces, new invention of the early and mid 19th century. Poe's not sure how he feels about that, if they're useful or good in the world. Very interested in that. Globalization. Which is something that has been in the works since Columbus, really, but is getting going in a very, very big way in the 19th century with industrialization, both in terms of better shipping and mass production, cheap consumer goods, bigger markets for those goods, and so on. And that's a real concern that Poe has here, globalization. How does this orangutan even get into our midst here in Paris? But then also something that's happening with industrialization is the growth of cities. 100 years before Poe, 90% of people lived in the countryside. In our world today, it's the opposite. 90% of people live in cities or suburbs, areas around cities. Poe's living in the midst of that transformation. And it means that cities now are places where everyone is a stranger. And that's a big part of the Murders in the Rue Morgue as well. So those are three things that we saw when we read that story that Poe clearly was uncomfortable with and maybe even a little afraid of as well.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and I think there's so much going on in Poe, and you brought up a very interesting point. I don't think I realized just kind of the significance of the cholera epidemics until I was reading some biographies of some of the presidents, some of the U.S. presidents in kind of the 1840s and things like that. And you're just seeing how cholera was just gripping the whole country.
Yes.
Yeah. And it's just something that I don't think I had really heard about too much.
Right. And we didn't know what the transmission method was. So it was something, I think we can go back to our own experience with COVID-19, though, for us, not knowing how it might be transmitted, or, knowing specifically, knowing for sure was something that really for us was only maybe about 2 months. But there was definite panic, washing your, everything you touched, scrubbing our hands, totally bloody. But there was a whole pandemic, really two, the second and third cholera pandemics, when people did not know what the method of transmission was. And that's absolutely terrifying. And Poe nails it. I mean, he really makes you afraid of it.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And then, of course, a staple, as we mentioned, would be Lovecraft. And of course, Lovecraft has had kind of a huge influence on tabletop gaming, possibly thanks to, poor copyright protection on his part. And I'm sure you touch on Lovecraft, as you said, quite a bit. What was Lovecraft telling us to be afraid of?
Yeah, Lovecraft, I think, also was afraid of just about everything. But, I guess that's what horror writers do, of course, right? Is look around and say, what can I be afraid of? Or how can I show that there's something that's potentially scary about that thing? But Lovecraft also is living at a really interesting time, a time of transition and a time of transformation, living between the First and the Second World Wars, writing all of his masterpieces. Well, maybe I shouldn't say that, but his most famous works, right? Certainly The Call of Cthulhu, The Dunwich Horror, and so on, Shadow over Innsmouth, during the Great Depression. And this is something that has a profound effect on Lovecraft. Lovecraft famously dies at a young age, doesn't make it to 50, dies of a disease, of a medical condition, but really dies of poverty, dies of malnutrition and inability to seek medical attention, which was going to be true whether or not we were in the Depression. But that situation, the sort of poor financial situation that he always found himself in, despite the fact that he's regarded today as having been a literary genius, really shaped and colored his life and his experience of things. And in particular, Lovecraft is very afraid of, he also is afraid of globalization. I think we should be clear about that. The particular form of globalization, I think, that he's afraid of, or the way that manifests, is a little bit different than for Poe. For Lovecraft, this manifests as a pretty strong stance opposed to immigration. But he's not alone at this time. The period really between about 1880 and the Second World War around the world is a period of protectionism. But so Lovecraft is looking around, especially when he lived in New York, a period, I think really right before the Great Depression. He was living in Brooklyn and saw a lot of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, and wrote a lot of stories. I mean, The Horror of Red Hook, I think, probably being the most famous of them there, that deal with his fears about immigration. But then, of course, Lovecraft is most famous for the idea of cosmic horror, the idea that humanity is insignificant in the cosmos, that we as individuals and maybe even as an entire species don't matter, and life is pointless, that there's no purpose to us. Though, of course, some people, I think, find that liberating. And if there is no purpose, if there's no point to us, then I can do what I want, right? Mm-hmm. But for Lovecraft and for many others, there is also something scary about this. And this is Lovecraft reacting to great advances in our understanding of cosmology and astronomy that are happening during what is frequently called the second scientific revolution of the 19th and early 20th centuries, where we've got suddenly these really, really amazing telescopes, and we've got some great mathematics now to understand what we're seeing out there. We're discovering planets, right? Lovecraft is writing at the time that Pluto is discovered and, dubbed a planet at that point. It's had some bad luck since then, I guess. But also, this is when Edwin Hubble is observing galaxies, right? The thing, realizing that some of the stars we see in the sky are actually so far away from us as to be outside of our own cluster of stars, but are another cluster of stars. And that's, we take that for granted because, like we said, we watch a lot of Star Trek, right? But can you imagine living in a world where that's new? It's really maybe not all that different from living through the first scientific revolution, when suddenly everyone is telling you that actually the sun does not go around the earth. It's the other way around. And Lovecraft has really tapped into the anxiety of that in his stories. And I think that's really what he's best known for.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I was always kind of struck when reading Lovecraft when, he mentions something, a certain people or a certain thing that happens, like a million years ago. But then he also then gives you a flash forward of something that's going to happen, thousands or tens of thousands of years in the future, right? And that kind of encapsulates that thing. It's just like, hey, look, we're here for a minute, but we're just going to be gone too, right?
Yeah, and it's really compelling. And I think, maybe something we should say too about the legacy of Lovecraft, that, not just in role playing, though that's huge. And that's how myself and our friend group got into Lovecraft, was via role playing for sure. But he's spawned all of this movie. I don't know, supposed to say movie literature, film literature, cinematic literature. I don't know. I'll let that stand. I'll be critical when I listen to the episode when it airs. But things like the Alien franchise, for example, are real homages or taking their cues from At the Mountains of Madness, right? This idea that there's this scary and hostile universe out there, that the time scales we're talking about, right, just mean we're so insignificant. And it is something that I think if we sit with for a while, it gets really uncomfortable.
Yeah. And I think just to mention Star Trek again, I think the Borg would have played on something like that as well, right? The whole, at least the first episode where the Borg are introduced is just like, we're not ready for what's out there. Like, you're here and you're going about your business in New York and you're doing your little things. Well, there's something out there that's going to eat you.
Yeah. I mean, the idea of machine life in general, right? Something that's just not like us in any way. I mean, Klingons are different from us, I suppose, as Homo sapiens, but also they're like us in being flesh and also bipeds, just with, forehead ridges and stuff, the classic Star Trek alien trope. But they're organic life forms like us, machine life. Now that's really out there. That's really, really crazy and really scary. And Lovecraft does some bit with machine life. And of course, Borg are also they're kind of space zombies. And Lovecraft's story, Herbert West Reanimator, is really probably the first of what I would call the modern zombie stories, right? All of our zombie traditions, or most of them anyway, stem from that story.
Yeah. That was a great story, by the way.
Oh yeah, it's awesome. That's one of my favorites. We haven't covered that yet, but I'll be excited when we do.
Yeah, that was incredible. All right, well, and trying to get to all of your podcasts today, but you have another one called Atoz. Can you kind of explain that one?
Yeah, well, Atoz is something of an outlier on the show in that, or on the network, I should say, in that most of our other shows are dealing with short fiction in one way or another. And I thought, lots of people write novels. Maybe it would be good to read some speculative fiction novels, right? Not just short stories and novellas. So Atoz is a show where it's just me solo, monthly show where I read a speculative fiction novel, so science fiction, fantasy, supernatural, horror, and look for a handful of themes and motifs, try to get at what that book is about. Also try to look at it from a writer craft perspective, what works, what doesn't work in the book as well. And it's actually our newest show. It's been out for less than a year at this point, but already having a really great time. Done about a dozen episodes of that show. Have done some Ursula Le Guin, done some Shirley Jackson, some Ken Stanley Robinson, Guy Gavriel Kay. Lots of great stuff. In fact, there's really only been so far one book that I've covered that maybe I wish I had some of that time back.
Oh gosh. Well, we don't have to mention that one if you don't want to. Now, the name of the show, again, everything comes back to Star Trek. You have a Star Trek reference built into the name of the show, right? Right.
Yeah, this is Mr. Atoz from Star Trek, the original series. He's the librarian of the library of libraries that has records of everything ever. I wanted to give the show a name that nodded to the expansiveness of it. And of course, speculative fiction loves libraries. Writers love libraries, right? Well, but, what are the things that speculative fiction writers get to do is imagine what would be the most amazing library of all time. And I think Mr. Atoz has it. So that was where I took the name from.
Yeah, absolutely. I would live in a library.
Oh, I would too, for sure, for sure.
Yeah. And just ask my wife. I have tons of books. Anyway,
Right.
She says too many, but I'm like, said no one ever.
No, not possible. Yeah, I'm in what we call the library in our house now, which is actually the basement that doesn't have any heat or anything. This is where my wife lets me keep the books.
Yeah. Yeah. What is one standout that you have covered so far on your podcast, Atoz?
Wow. Yeah, that's a great question.
You mentioned a lot of good names there, so I know that's.
I did, and you have to forgive my hesitation, which is simply that we have only released about a dozen of them, but I've recorded about 40 of them. So I want to give an answer that is something your listeners can actually go listen to. I would say that probably for me, a real standout was Ursula Le Guin's book, The Beginning Place, and I bring that up as a standout. I mean, I think people love Ursula Le Guin. She's a beautiful prose stylist. So very smart, right? She's so interested in the human condition, both in her science fiction and in her fantasy. But The Beginning Place is a fantasy book that is not part of the Earthsea. And I wanted to do something that was standalone. And when I was looking around at her bibliography, this book was not well regarded on Goodreads. It's certainly not as well regarded as virtually every other book of hers. And so it seemed like, oh, this is the one bad book she wrote. And I went to it with that in mind. And it is not a bad book. It is an amazing book. I really loved it. It's a great meditation on fantasy literature, particularly its origin in fairy tales, and she's playing with genre tropes and also looking at how stories and worlds of stories can bring us together as people, which is really what doing podcasts is about, book clubs are about, and also what role-playing games are about as well. So I found that to be a really, truly beautiful book.
Okay, now I haven't read that one, so I'll have to add it to my list that already has like 9,000 books on it.
That's all of us, right?
Yeah.
That's all of us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what you said there is interesting. I think the idea of a shared story is very powerful, and we can see that throughout history, shared stories are what united nations and countries and peoples, and it is. I don't know. To me, it is just fascinating to see that in small groups, how, at the gaming table, I will have a shared story with some friends that I can, maybe I haven't spoken to them in 20 years because they moved away or something. And I can send them a short message with a few series of what would seem like meaningless words. And they will like crack up laughing and write me back like 8 paragraphs telling me how they love playing that game, 25 years ago or whatever it was.
Right. I mean, this is how we craft group identities, right? Is having these shared stories. I mean, here we're talking about in-jokes, which is, that's what friends are for, right? Is to have in-jokes, but it's living these experiences together, and the way that we use stories for that. To me, this is, I am no anthropologist. I am a historian, but I am no anthropologist. But to me, this is the thing that differentiates humans from other animals, is our ability to tell stories and our ability to tell stories together, to create worlds that only exist in our minds, and to transmit them to other people and share them together, whether that's watching Star Trek, reading a book, or sitting around a gaming table together. I mean, it's a crazy, beautiful thing that we have as humans that we shouldn't take for granted, and that we certainly should cherish.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Now, another one of your podcasts is the Gene Wolfe Literary Podcast. Why don't you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, well, so this is, I guess, what it says on the box. It's me and my co-host from Elder Sign, Brandon Buddha, again, reading as much of Gene Wolfe as we can. Gene Wolfe, science fiction, fantasy, and supernatural horror writer, active from the 1970s up until his death in 2019. In fact, his last book came out only this year, actually, as a posthumous publication. We're reading through his works in chronological order, and we're also trying to give as much emphasis to his short fiction as to his novels, his long fiction. In fact, many of his novels, of course, are in series. His most famous work is called The Solar Cycle, which is made up of 3 series of books, the most famous of which is the first one, which is the Book of the New Sun. That's the one that got its own role-playing game from suburbs back in the 80s, which we will talk about someday. We haven't gotten to the Book of the New Sun yet. And this has been a real great joy. Gene Wolfe, a really fascinating character. He was a veteran, a combat veteran of the Korean War. He was an engineer who grew up in Houston and then moved to the Chicago suburbs, which is where I grew up, though never actually ran into him at a library or something like that, though that is why all the libraries I had access to had tons of Gene Wolfe books growing up because he was a local writer. But he also was someone who, as an adult, converted to Catholicism. This was something that he did to marry his wife, Rosemary, but that is also wrapped up in his experiences in the Korean War. So an incredibly fascinating person who has a writing career that spans 50 years or close to 50 years anyway. It's been really wonderful to track his writings. Not that we're very far into his career. We started in 1967. We are just now getting into 1975.
Wow. So yeah, you have a long way to go.
We do a very long way to go.
Yeah. And what would you say are just some themes that you are picking up that kind of set him apart as an author?
Yeah, well, Gene Wolfe is someone who is extremely interested, certainly in his early phase, which is his more science fiction phase. I think he is remembered more as a fantasy writer, and in part that's because of the Book of the New Sun, which is a science fantasy series in the style of Jack Vance, someone very important, of course, to Dungeons and Dragons and role-playing games in general. But his early period is really much more taken up with science fiction, and in that phase, he's supremely interested in environmentalism, that this is something that's extremely important to him as an engineer. He has a real idea of Earth as a whole system, and is very interested in looking at the ways that we are screwing it up, the ways that we are poisoning the planet for future generations. And so he's got a lot of imagined futures that are quite dark. He doesn't really write. He's written one book that does imagine a kind of environmental, apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic story, but for the most part, that's not quite what he's doing. But he envisions this as one of the reasons why people take to space. So that's something he's definitely interested in. Even more so than that, though, is robots, and this is really wrapped up in the question of what does it mean to be a person. And so thinking of robots and artificial intelligence, what makes something or someone a person or not a person, and how can we tell? And he approaches this question from his twin perspectives of being an engineer, someone who is interested in machines and works with machines, but also as being an active Catholic Christian who is very much interested in the salvation of every individual, and interested in thinking of individuals as beings with souls, and every individual as deserving of human dignity as well. And so he's got some really interesting perspectives on that.
Yeah. Some fascinating stuff there. And of course, always a big question as technology kind of takes over our lives is
right.
What does it mean to be a human, and or are we just letting the machines run everything?
Yeah, and of course, this is a classic science fiction idea, question, right? I mean, Asimov is famous for robots and the positronic brain and so on, and Wolfe is responding to that. But all of these guys who were writing about robots and artificial intelligence, I mean, these are generations ago now at this point, and we're still they're envisioning the world that we're living in, or perhaps that our children will live in, where they really are going to have to know. They're going to have to know legally, how do you tell if this thing is a person or not? And that's what makes these books so important, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. This is totally random, but I was listening to a podcast a while back about AI and machine learning, and the scientist on there, she said, the problem isn't that AI will eventually become so smart that it will conquer the world. The problem is that AI is dumb and it has already conquered the world.
Right.
Yes.
It does feel like we're living in that world sometimes, at least.
Yeah, because it controls everything from our search results to what movies we get shown, what products we get shown. It's all AI.
Yeah, I mean, it's here. It's already here.
Yep, absolutely. Now you have everything comes back to Star Trek. So you have another podcast called Lower Decks, which is about Star Trek.
Yeah, absolutely. We do. Lower Decks is great fun. This is a show I do with my co-host, Valerie Hoagland. And this show started as a show about Star Trek Discovery. When we got very excited when there was going to be new Star Trek. Yeah. Valerie and I both hardcore Trekkers from way back. I got very excited there was going to be a new Star Trek show. And we did enjoy Discovery, but it took a very, very, very long time to get back on the air. And part of that was the pandemic. And in the meantime, my wife and I had a baby. And so it turned out that there was going to be no time in my life to do a weekly Star Trek show. So we rebranded Lower Decks, and now we're just doing random episodes of old school Star Trek as a monthly show. And we've been having a real blast with it. Star Trek, of course, is famous for having some real masterpiece stories, and then also some stories where the main characters turn into salamanders. So, we've done some highs, we've done some lows, and it's been a tremendous amount of fun. Star Trek is such a great show, great franchise, great series of shows.
Yeah, absolutely. What are some of your maybe one favorite episode from, say, the original series?
Oh, wow. Well, yes, I think my favorite episode from the original series, not one that we've talked about yet, in part, I think, because I want to delay my own gratification. I feel like I have to save my favorite episodes. But my favorite original series episode, well, now I'm hemming and hawing here, right? But I'm going to say Balance of Terror. I think that's my instinct, is to say Balance of Terror, which is this is the episode where we meet Romulans for the first time. It's essentially a submarine story in space, a submarine battle in space. It's Captain Kirk against Mark Leonard, who more famously plays Spock's dad, but in this case is playing a Romulan captain. And the point of this story, and this is one of the things I really love about Star Trek, the original series, is how much it is about it's about war. It's dealing with the Second World War. Almost everyone on the show has some experience in the Second World War or the Korean War, but then also the Vietnam War is happening while this show is on the air. And this is an episode, Balance of Terror, that has a real strong anti-war message. It's asking why are we shooting at each other? And it's really a story about how Kirk and this Romulan captain come to have great respect for each other and to admire each other, and in fact even to realize that they're essentially the same, that they fulfill the same role and function in their society. They have the same responsibilities to their crew and also the same responsibility to the governments that they work for, and that in some ways they have more in common with each other than they have with civilians back home. And then wondering, why are we trying to kill each other? Why are our societies trying to kill each other when really we're all people and we should find some way to get along? What are we even fighting for? It's a really profound episode.
Yeah, I agree. That is a very very excellent episode, and it does kind of parallel Run Silent, Run Deep. I think is the movie and a novel, I believe.
Right. I mean, it sometimes is almost shot for shot with the film, and is a great space adaptation of that. But do you have a favorite TOS episode?
Oh yeah, I do. Well, I have so many.
Right. Exactly.
It's usually better to say which ones I just don't like to watch too often because I like so many of them. If I had to pick like an ultimate favorite, I really enjoy A Taste of Armageddon. That is the episode where, again, about war, not surprising that a lot of those writers and that were thinking about war, as you mentioned, a number of them were veterans of World War II or Korea, or now they're watching possibly their sons and their brothers fighting in Vietnam. So they were thinking a lot about that. So A Taste of Armageddon is two planets are at war and they have forgotten why they are at war, but they have sanitized the war. So like fake bombs or like it's almost played like laser tag or something, but then the casualties have to just willingly walk into a box and be incinerated. And I just thought that concept just kind of always gets me, because Kirk makes a kind of a speech, of course, at the end about how, war is messy and war is horrible and there is so much suffering during it. That's why we avoid it. You have taken out the suffering of war, so you can keep fighting for 500 years instead of after, 4 or 5 years, just say, okay, we've had enough. This is too much suffering. And so that episode kind of always speaks to me.
Yeah, that's a fantastic episode. And Kirk's monologues, right, of course, are famous, but I think they're often very awesome. And this is certainly one of the best of them. I mean, it's an impassioned anti-war speech that really is speaking to the devastation of the Second World War, of having lived through all of that ugliness and all of that horror. And yeah, if you don't see that around you, it's very easy to get rah-rah about war, or even just accepting of war. This is certainly an experience of our world. I alluded earlier to the fact that I'm a professor at a university. I teach history classes, and it is always surprising to me. Well, it has ceased being surprising, I should say. But what I find every semester is that most of my students have no idea that the United States is a nation at war. That, in fact, we're in the middle of the longest war we've ever waged, that we have been waging for their entire lives, at least as far back as their memory goes. And they don't even know that it's happening because it's sanitized for us in the same way that is happening in this Star Trek episode.
Yeah. That is a powerful point that I think I know I certainly don't think about as much, that there are Marines in Afghanistan that are younger than the war.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Which is, that's, it's kind of, it's just almost, when you think about it in that sense, it's almost staggering that it would have been that going on for a generation. Basically.
Yeah. I mean, it is the Vietnam War, which is so much a part of the context of Star Trek, the original series, really pales in comparison. Even though people at the time were saying that the Vietnam War was going to be an interminable war. There's the famous Joe Haldeman novel called The Forever War. That's really about his experiences in Vietnam, but he puts it in space. That's a brilliant novel about that. And yeah, the Afghan War been going on twice as long.
Yeah, it's something else. And and I think too, I mean, the Taste of Armageddon could have been kind of speaking to kind of the Midwest, America in the time of World War II, even, because you see pictures, of course, of London and Germany and Japan after the war, but the Midwest, of course, a lot of the young men were missing, but we were never bombed in the Midwest. Right. We were so far away from where, just absolute devastation happened. Yeah. So some very powerful stuff. What about the Next Generation? Do you have a favorite episode in the Next Generation?
I do, absolutely. My favorite Next Generation episode is the Inner Light, which is a controversial stance. I think this is an episode people either love or hate. This is the episode where Patrick Stewart gets hit by a laser beam, we'll say, in space, and lives an entire lifetime in a kind of fantasy life. He's on another planet. He doesn't really know who he is anymore, but he's married and he's got kids, and he is an important member of a community in a civilization that is dying as their climate is collapsing, and he lives this entire life. And then at the end of it, he comes back to being Captain Picard. And of course, then for the rest of the series, he's going to have to grapple with the fact that he just lived decades and decades and decades as this other person. And where are his kids? Where are his grandkids? And so on. But it is really a beautiful episode that one is about climate change and about how we should take a scientific approach to doing something about that rather than a short-sighted political approach. That's the lesson there, not the only Star Trek or only science fiction story, right, that is about that. that. But it's this beautiful story about Picard himself, who, when we meet him at the very first episode, the pilot, Encounter at Farpoint, what we know is that he hates kids. His most famous line is "Shut up, Wesley," right? Is telling a kid to shut up, right? And here he is, he's transformed because against his will, he is forced to have a family, and he is not into this when he first starts living this life because he doesn't remember anything that led up to it. But by the end, this is something profoundly important to him. He loves his wife, he loves his kids, he loves his grandkids, and suddenly he has that taken away from him, and he never recovers from that at that point. And so it's a heartbreaking episode.
Yeah, and some years back, I would have probably said that would have been my favorite episode as well. And I still enjoy it, quite a bit. It is I don't know. It was one of those things. It really showed, what you can do with science fiction in a TV show, right? That you can, since you're dealing with science fiction, you can just, change settings, and your audience is just like, I'm right there. And it is a excellent episode. I would think, as far as my favorites go, like I said, with the original series, I have so many favorites. It'd probably be easier to say some that I just don't like watching is too much. But, I do love The Inner Light is a great episode. I do like Yesterday's Enterprise, which is a time travel episode, which is just an excellent episode. Again, about war.
Yes.
Yeah. And then Best of Both Worlds, part 1 and part 2. I think I remember watching them at the time, and they were just so powerful with this kind of threat to the Federation, just wondering, what was going to become of the Federation with this enemy that can just, you hit them with one thing and they just adapt to it, and they have a defense for it within seconds.
Yeah, and they don't even care about you. I mean, this is where the Borg, as you were saying earlier, are a great representation of cosmic horror as we see them in the Best of Both Worlds. By the time we get to the film franchise and Voyager, a little bit different. But here in the Best of Both Worlds, one of the things that really defines them is that they are just not even interested in us as individuals unless we threaten them. They are only concerned about the technology, and it is so creepy. Best of Both Worlds. I mean, I think that's what most people would say. So, that's where I say Inner Light was a little bit controversial because it is, of course, one of these classic Star Trek episodes that's not really a Star Trek episode because it's about Patrick Stewart in tights, as opposed to the Starfleet uniform. But Best of Both Worlds is so iconic. It's so great. It spawns so much, not just in Star Trek, but in wider literature. Yeah. The score for Best of Both Worlds, too, is fantastic. And it creates the idea of, ending your season on a cliffhanger where you're not sure if Captain Picard is dead or not, which is because the production staff wasn't sure if Patrick Stewart was coming back or not. And this is now a formula that at least all of the classic Trek shows have followed ever since, and it's a formula we might see in some of the new Trek come back as well.
Yeah. And, that idea about the Borg just not caring about you. And when they were first introduced, right, it's technological and biological, they're just going to take this one bit of technology that's better than theirs. And if the human heart valve or something is a little bit better than theirs, they're just going to take that, right? They don't care about anything like anything else. So, I mean, they made, one of the most scariest villains because, there is no, how do you negotiate with somebody like that, right?
Yeah, and that's terrifying. I mean, they're basically a disease, right? How do you negotiate with that? They're essentially a virus that replicates itself, and there's nothing to be done about it. Yeah, the Borg are awesome.
Yeah, and I don't think Inner Light is as controversial as you make it out to be because I see that on the tops of a lot of people's lists. Like I said, maybe even up until about 10 years ago or so, I would have said that would have been my absolute favorite. I'll go outside of the box a little bit and say an episode that I actually just really enjoy watching so much. Like I just enjoy it so much. It is, and this will be a little controversial because I think it is really good. Is the episode Peak Performance. from kind of the end of season 2, where the Enterprise is going to participate in war games with an old derelict ship, and the tactician master comes, kind of the strategy master comes to oversee these war games, and Data figures out how to beat him at his own game, and Riker figures out how to beat Picard in war strategy. I guess I'm sticking close to war episodes, but
yeah, and sticking close to episodes too that are Riker versus Picard, because this is a feature of the best of both worlds as well. This is actually kind of the precursor to that. But yeah, this is a great episode. I vividly remember the first time I saw this back in middle school, because the tactician character is so villainous. You just hate him immediately. I don't know who that actor is, but nailed it, right?
Yeah.
Made us hate him from the start, because he was picking on Data, right? You know, we all love.
Yeah.
And what a great episode. Classic line there, Data at the end explains how he wins, is that he won by not trying to beat the tactician. He won by trying to prevent the tactician from beating him, right?
Yeah.
Very, very profound seeming line anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. And Worf gets some great kind of one-liners in it as well, where he gets to say, Riker says, well, how can we beat them? They're more superior than us in every way. And Worf says, guile.
Right.
and then he tells Data that he's wagered in the ship's pool heavily on him. And he says, well, what if I lose? And he said, I'll be irritated. And it was just some great little character moments there in an episode. So I enjoy that. So if I rank that number 1, I would be like trashed on. If I post that on Reddit, I'd be trashed.
Right.
So I better, and now I got it on tape that I think that episode is like is awesome. I don't know if it's the best, but I love it.
Well, this is the great thing about Star Trek, is that every single episode is somebody's favorite episode. Even Threshold, the Voyager episode about people turning into salamanders, that is near universally maligned. There are people out there for whom that's their favorite episode. And you know what? For them, they're right. And that's the beautiful thing about stories, is that we can enjoy what we want to enjoy. We can love what we want to love. And you're not wrong. This is a great episode. In fact, you're making me want to go watch it right now.
Me too, actually. I want to rewatch it. But yeah, I could talk about Star Trek all day. So we probably should stop. But you have, because another episode I like, I'll just get it in really quick, is Tin Man, which I know is really controversial, but I love the episode where they find a living star creature, and it is mainly focused on a guest star, Tam Elbrin, who is a Betazoid who is a super powerful Betazoid who is having kind of mental breakdowns because he can hear everybody's thoughts. And I love the score in that episode. They had a very mystical kind of score that represented Tin Man. And I think that one's great. Although I have said that before and I have been reviled, but I really like that one too.
Yeah, I think that's a great episode as well. I mean, it's a great show. Star Trek: The Next Generation is awesome. Even the bad episodes, I think that, and these are some pretty early episodes you're invoking here too. And I think there's just a kind of accepted wisdom among fandom, and maybe among casual fandom, that, the early seasons of Next Generation are not good. And, should, if you meet someone who says, oh, I've always wanted to watch that show, where should I start? You're supposed to say, start with season 3, and maybe not even that, maybe just start with Best of Both Worlds, which is the end of season 3, and go forward. But I think there's so many great episodes early on in the run. And, just because there's an episode you don't like doesn't mean it's not going to seem great for somebody else. And this is actually one of the things I love about doing Lower Decks with Valerie, is that she and I are going to Star Trek for different things. And so often I'll go into an episode feeling fairly lukewarm about it, and she'll convince me why it's like the best episode that there's ever been, and vice versa. And we get to have some great conversations going back and forth on that. And, this is one of the joys of Star Trek, and one of the joys of participating in stories together.
Yeah. Absolutely. All right. Well, you have one more podcast. It is, if four wasn't enough, I guess. Hanging Out with the Dream King. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, this is the Neil Gaiman podcast that I do with yet another co-host. This is my my childhood friend, Brent. Of course, all my co-hosts are personal friends in real life, but Brent and I go back further than Valerie and I or Brandon and I. And in fact, Brent is the person with whom I read Dragonlance books and got into role-playing with in middle school, and Star Trek, and really all of these things, Lovecraft and Poe. It's been our journey together. But Neil Gaiman was a huge part of our lives in the 1990s, especially The Sandman and also his early short story collections. This is really before he became, the famous novelist that he is today, and maybe famous TV person that he is today, or person who's written things that have been adapted for screen anyway. And so we decided that we should do a monthly show about Neil Gaiman. Right now, we're mostly going through his masterpiece comic book series, The Sandman, together. But in between volumes, we take a pretty sizable break and we check out some other things. So we'll do some short stories. We might actually do some things that are Neil Gaiman adjacent, something that maybe has been brought up in an issue of Sandman. Maybe that's G.K. Chesterton. Maybe that's Rudyard Kipling. Go check out what Neil Gaiman is talking about, why he likes these writers. That's a lot of fun. And of course, Neil Gaiman also has written for film and television. We're getting ready actually right now to record our first Neil Gaiman written TV episode, or our discussion of it, I should say. And that's the Babylon 5 episode that he did. I have not watched it again yet. We're recording this in about 2 weeks. And I'm very excited to take that little side adventure away from the Sandman and go see what he did on Babylon 5. And, when we're done with Sandman, we'll get to some of the prose novels and we'll look at some of his other comics as well.
Yeah, I had forgotten that he had written a Babylon 5 episode, but now that you mention it, I do remember that. But I'm having a hard time placing the episode. I need to. It just means I need to watch Babylon 5 again, I guess.
Yeah, well, same here. In fact, actually, Valerie and I just did a Babylon 5 episode as well that a listener had asked us to do as a Lower Decks episode. That was the first time I'd watched Babylon 5 in a long time, though I love Babylon 5 so much that I still have my actual physical DVDs of it, which is great. But yeah, season 5 of Babylon 5, which is where this Neil Gaiman episode is, this is when J. Michael Straczynski, who had written every single episode of Babylon 5 up to that point, decided that maybe he should take a nap or two. And so had a series of guest writers come on. And of course, this was a big show in the 90s. And so lots of people wanted to participate. And Neil Gaiman got one in an episode called Day of the Dead. Though I will say right now, my memory of this is fuzzy too. I couldn't tell you any of the plot points.
Yeah, I couldn't either. So, but I did remember that his name was attached to that somehow. So that is fascinating. I think it is interesting when you see people who are known for creating their own things then write for somebody else's. It's just an interesting, if they're still injecting a lot of their own kind of mythos and their own themes into somebody else's work. And of course, we got that we've been talking about it so much. We got that, of course, with the original Star Trek, where it had a number of incredible science fiction writers who were dropping in to write episodes, like Richard Matheson, and the list goes on.
It does. And some of these are writers that we've covered over on Elder Sign. We haven't done Matheson yet, though he's on our list for coming up. But like Robert Bloch, who was, one of H.P. Lovecraft's friends and kind of proteges, wrote 2 episodes of Star Trek, the original series. And it's really awesome. This is not how TV is done today. We have writers' room. You got staff writers. You're not getting, the great literary writers of the day to pen episodes for you anymore, which is maybe kind of a shame. I wish there was a show that was doing that.
Yeah. And even less like staff writers even now, because with a 10 or a 13 episode season, 2 or 3 writers can write all of those episodes. So that's right. Yeah. So we're really, getting kind of their vision. I think we can see from the quality of television that the stories are much more coherent, right? So you can pull them through because, of course, they're coming from, a writing team, without any guests in. But in an era of television when especially in original series, you had 25 episodes, and Next Generation, 22 episodes a season, and Babylon 5 even the same way. You would get to points to where I'm sure you were just like, we need an episode, and I'm tired. I've written 10 of them or something. We need people to write episodes, and they had to kind of dip into, other resources. And I think we got some great stuff out of that, though.
Yeah, we sure did. But to be clear, I'm with you. We're in the golden age of TV, and I'm not lamenting the awesome TV we had at all.
Yeah, sure. It's just changed so much. Yeah,
it has.
It would be where, Neil Gaiman, he would just write all 10 episodes of a season or something, instead of just popping in on a guest show in somebody else's created universe or something like that.
Yeah, and in some way that is what's happening. With he's got so many things going to TV now. American Gods and Good Omens, of course, which was almost universally praised. And there is going to be a Sandman TV show. I think, though, this is one of these projects that's been delayed by the pandemic, of course. Mm-hmm. But Gaiman is not necessarily writing those scripts, but his hand, is there on the project behind the scenes. I think having some input on who the writers are, and on the phone for advice and that sort of thing. And then it is just a small creative team that are adapting these novels as 10 episode stories, coherent stories on TV. And yeah, it's a great time to be a TV watcher for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because not only are we getting some of the greatest projects right now, we can go back and watch stuff that was from the 60s and 50s. Oh, yeah. We can watch it all. So
at will. It's great.
Yeah.
It's great.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, now, I've had you on the line here quite a while, so I don't want to take up too much of your time. But we've been talking about all of these phenomenal stories and all of these writers, and a lot of themes that are pretty heady, kind of heady, I guess, in some ways. One of my deals with the podcast here is that I think, if we are exposed to more stories, whether they be novels, television, movies, what have you, I think that makes us better game masters. And that's why I kind of put a focus on, speaking to novelists and other writers on my podcast. Do you think that exposure to stories makes us better at storytelling?
Absolutely, I do. I mean, I'll put my educator hat back on first and say that I think exposure to stories makes us better people in general. There's, I read a lot of pedagogical literature so that I can be trying to be the best teacher that I can be, and hopefully I'm succeeding more often than not. But one of the things that we know that we're able to measure as scientifically as we can measure things about people is that reading in particular, but exposure to other types of stories as well at a young age is something that is fundamental to instilling a sense of empathy, for teaching young people to empathize with others, to imagine what it's like to be other people, and being empathetic, right? Thinking about things from the perspective of others is one of the core elements of us as individuals. We as individuals being forces or a force for good in the world, and so stories are hugely important for that. But also, you're spot on that the more you know about stories, the more stories you've been exposed to, the more you've thought critically about the stories. Even if all what that means is breaking down how the story works. Where are what are the beats here in the plot? How does that correspond with arcs and character development? What are the moments of tension, right? Why does this chapter end here and not somewhere else? Right? What's the effect the writer is trying to instill in me? Things like that obviously are going to make you a better game master, right? Where you're trying to create this, to create this shared story with the gamers at your table, to create this shared and lived experience in the moment. Yeah, knowing what the tricks are, I think, is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're absolutely right that, I may be talking about a trivial or tangential kind of, benefit that will make us a better game master. But I think you're absolutely right that I think that it makes us better people, that if we are able to, maybe walk in somebody else's shoes for a little bit and see what that's like and what they had to deal with. It would hopefully make us a little bit more empathetic when we see things on the news or things around us that are going on in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think role-playing, I mean, from my own personal experience, I think role-playing games are a huge part of this as well, where literally what you're doing is pretending to be someone else with other people who are pretending to be someone else. And not every role-playing game does this, right? But most of them, we're trying to go out and save the world, or, at least save this small town from goblin raiders or something like that. We're pretending to be people who are super powered, more powered than us, and we're trying to do something good in the world. And that's what a great thing that is.
Yeah, absolutely. And then to your point about just, even just almost surface level thinking about your story, just, different stories. If we see movies or TV shows or books, it's just thinking exactly like you said, why did that chapter end there? Why did that scene happen right before a commercial? Why did this scene happen right before that scene? And just even basic things like that, thinking along those lines, just help us just understand what the creators and what the writers of those were trying to do. It just, I think it just improves our storytelling, immensely when we can kind of, after we set down the book, just, take a little walk or think about it a little bit. And you think, you can see what they were trying to do here. And that's exactly what a game master should try to do. Do we end on an upbeat? Do we get something very dark and devastating? Well, you might want to cut, right? You might want to cut away and let that hang for a minute and let people think about that.
Well, and reading stories too is just great fodder for even just getting the bare bones plot, right? I mean, something that we like to do on Elder Sign especially is ask our listeners, hey, what do you think is the sequel to this story? And let us know, right? Some, a lot of our audience are people who are writers or are aspiring writers. And, we get a lot of people sending us their answer to exactly that, a little story they've written as a sequel or a spin-off from this character or that character. And that's great fodder for role-playing adventures as well. What happens next, or what was happening off page or off camera while the heroes were doing this? What were these other minor characters up to? And you can spin out a story for your players from that as well. So lots of great reasons to expose yourself to stories, whether that's print or screen.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I completely agree with that, because anything that gets us thinking about situations that we can throw our players in, if you watch that original Star Trek episode and you think, what would have happened next? What would have happened next? You can run your players through that, and they will probably love it. But I also think, just being exposed to story, even if you're not thinking too deeply about story structure and things like that, I think that just having kind of a library of situations and complications kind of in our memory, I know that helps me when I run a game, because I can think of a certain situation that happened in a book or a movie, and I can just put that into my game, and it's not exactly what happened in the movie or in the book, but I can just take kind of that situation and put it right into my game, and my players are probably going to react positively to that, or at least it will give them some kind of complication or something to overcome. Like, you say, we've been talking a lot about science fiction, say the Borg, right? If I got that idea in my head, well, what if I confront my players with some kind of intelligent machine and start making them think about that in some way? And, and it's not that we're just running the Borg. They're just not fighting against the Borg, but I'm taking kind of that situation or that theme, and now they are confronted with it.
Yeah, and I mean, this also gives you the opportunity then to kind of lure your players into something that seems familiar to them, and then reverse the expectations, right? Or subvert the expectations, reverse the trope, which is always a great move to, I don't know, to shock gamers, also get them mad at you, I suppose, too.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Well, like I said, Glenn, we've been talking for a long time. Well, where can people listen to your podcast? Since you have 5 of them, where can they listen to all of them?
Right. Well, we're everywhere you can find podcasts, whatever app you might be listening to or using to listen to podcasts, you can find us. The shows, I'll just say them again. Here are Elder Sign, a weird fiction podcast, Hanging Out with the Dream King, a Neil Gaiman podcast, Lower Decks, a Star Trek podcast, Atoz, a speculative fiction podcast, and then the Gene Wolfe Literary Podcast. You can just search those on your apps, but you can also find us at our website. The podcast network is called Clay Temple Media, and claytemplemedia.com is where you can find us. Every single episode of every podcast is available on the website, but then also there are links to Apple Podcast and Spotify, Amazon Music, and so on, where you can easily be directed to the show in the platform of your choice, if you like. The website too is where we have a forum where we have fairly robust conversations with listeners about the stories and TV shows that we're engaging with. We do also have a subreddit where we have conversations like that as well. And that subreddit is just called Clay Temple Media. And occasionally we like to post pictures of books on Twitter if you're interested in following us there as well.
All right. Well, I will make sure that I put links to the podcast and your website and your social media in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. So everybody who is listening right now can head over there and check out those links so you can listen to Glenn's podcasts. Well, Glenn, it was a fascinating discussion. I could talk about Star Trek all day. I could talk about fiction and books and movies and TV shows all day as well. But thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This was a real pleasure. This is going to be the highlight of my day for sure. So thank you.
All right, there you have it, guys. Man, I really hope you enjoyed my conversation with Glenn today. It was just so fascinating to be able to talk about some of those great works of science fiction and fantasy. Some of those works are the foundations that created or helped create or vastly influenced the world we know as tabletop RPG gaming. As I mentioned at the end of the episode, I have provided links to all of Glenn's podcasts in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. Trust me, you want to listen to some of his podcasts. Insight into literature and science fiction and fantasy stories will help us immensely at the gaming table. I cannot stress that enough. Exposure to stories can make us better storytellers, better game masters, better role players, and, as we touched on a little bit, better people as well. Now, if you want some free stuff, head over to dicegeeks.com/free. You'll get 10 free dungeon maps. You'll never miss an episode of this show. And each and every Friday, you will get an email update from me letting you know what is going on in the universe I like to call Dice Geeks. Now, hey guys, if you really enjoy this podcast, consider supporting it in some way. You can rate, review, subscribe, like, join, whatever, wherever you are listening to this podcast right now. There's a lot of things you can do, all right, guys? Some of those things just take a second, just pressing a button, and they help the show immensely. Now, if you really like the show and you want me to keep making these episodes, please consider supporting the show financially at patreon.com/dicegeeks. You can find all the info there. It would be greatly appreciated. Now, hey guys, each and every Wednesday I bring you a new interview. Nothing is changing about that for at least a while. So next week we have another interview, and I hope you will listen to that one as well. But until then, keep gaming.